And now for Chapter 5. This is Forbidden Child. Petrick was looking at Mistress Fris's scowl lines from the corner of his vision. He wondered how long it took to make such deep lines permanent. Did she have to start when she was young? You're lucky this sinful contraption of yours didn't crash directly into one of the childless. She picked up the saucer from her desk and then tossed it down in punctuation. Yes, ma'am, Petrick said with a wince. Blessedly, the crashing chandelier had hurt no one. But the fallout was nonetheless swift and severe. Choosing Day had been cancelled for everyone. Fris had denounced the use of technology to the appalled crowd, and Petrick and his friends had issued a mumbled plea for forgiveness. Petrick felt Fris's eyes boring into his forehead and squirmed, looking at the multitude of hand-carved busts of other former headmistresses and headmasters that covered the paneled walls of the office. Their sharp lines scowled at him, too, and he found himself wondering, was Fris trying to be like them, or were such dour faces just a requirement of the job? Fris stalked over to the box on the floor that was full of wires and straps and bolts, and she hoisted it up directly on top of the saucer, which gave way with a deflating crunch. Recite to me the sacred caution. I am mother of Indikar, he said the words without inflection. Every child on Indikar knew them by rote. I choose to live under her protection and eat the fruit she bears with my own hands, for she will not lead me astray. Damned are those who forget Mother Indikar and work with anything but their own two hands. Fris finished the intonement. She paused to let the words sink in. We choose a way of life without such technologies because they are evil. That's not true. Petrick finally met Fris's gaze. What happened today is more proof that is true. It was just an accident. Those are our rules. My father says that machines are just tools. Only we are good or wicked. Your father is the one who left you here, Petrick. The words landed like a physical blow. Fris looked down at her desk. Well, he's coming back, Petrick said. Is that why you did this today? She gestured to the box and the crushed saucer underneath. Is that why you continue to defy the ways of Mother Indikar? Because you think he's coming back for you? I do it because I like doing it. Are you trying not to be chosen? Petrick shrugged. Everyone needs a family. Family is life. I have my father. Fris pointed to the office door. What about your two friends sitting outside? What about them? Do you not think about them? How your actions affect them? Do they not deserve a family? To be chosen? Petrick felt his cheeks redden, and he looked back down to the floor. Had he thought of Suzy and Barry? Know this, boy. You were left alone in this world because your father loved his machines and his stars more than he loved being here with you. He left you here at Childers, under our care, to be with them. We are your family, not him. You are responsible to your family, not him. She moved in front of Petrick, took his chin with her hand, and gently raised his gaze to her. We do not chase after the stars. We are here, rooted to Mother Indikar at our feet, and it is the purest, most sacred way to live in a universe filled with sorrow and evil. You will realize this someday. Petrick looked back at her, his cheeks still burning. He said nothing. Your friends out there will follow you anywhere, she said, which means you are responsible for them. You must remember that before you act. She looked at him until she was satisfied he'd heard. She stood and looped back around behind her desk, where she then gestured to the saucer in the box. Now, she said, this is what's going to happen. Barry couldn't sit still. He wiggled his butt on the hard wooden bench for what was probably the trillionth time and got an elbow in the ribs from Suzy. Ow! He said. Stop it, Suzy said, and Barry stopped moving. The reprieve only lasted a moment. Barry began to swing his legs back and forth from under the bench. Suzy leaned back with a grunt. "What do you think Fris and Petrick are talking about in there?" Barry asked. "Probably Petrick's stupid machine and how stupid his idea was to build it for choosing day. I swear I'm going to break his nose." "What are we going to talk about with Fris?" "I'm not going to talk about anything with Fris," Suzy said. "Yeah, but she has that way of getting stuff out of you. You know." He looked at the door to her office, just a few paces from where they were sitting, and his legs swung a little faster under the bench. "Bet she's really ripping into Petrick in there." He looked back at Suzy when she didn't reply. She had her eyes closed and her head against the wall. Barry slid himself to the rear of the bench to join her. "We should tell her this was all Petrick's fault." "Don't you dare." "But it's the truth. It was all his idea. You snitch on Petrick and I'll break your nose." "But you just said you were going to break Petrick's nose." Suzy opened an eye. "Yeah, well, I'll break both." There was a three-eyed stare-down between the two of them until a smile cracked Barry's face, and he tried to suppress a giggle. That proved a bad idea, because it came out anyway, as an odd snort-burp hybrid that hurt the inside of his nose. "Ow!" he said, and Suzy let out a chuckle, despite herself, and then both of them were laughing. It died down, and Barry realized he felt a little less anxious. Suzy could have that effect on him, even when she was grumpy. He chewed on his bottom lip and looked back over at the door to Fris's office. "You think we'll get in more trouble when we all stick together?" "I think we're in big trouble any way you cut it." "You think they'll make us fix the chandelier?" "No, the adults will do that. They'll make us clean the hall, though." Barry nodded and let out a big sigh. "I hate cleaning." The two of them were startled into upright positions when the door to Fris's office swung open. They looked up from their hallway bench to see Petrick standing in the doorway. His face was bright red, and his arms were ramrod straight at his sides. Fris's firm hand on his shoulder. "Barry, Suzy, Petrick has something to say to you," Fris said. She looked down sternly at the stiff Petrick. She gave his shoulder a meaningful squeeze. Petrick cast his eyes down before he spoke. "I'm sorry, Barry. I'm sorry, Suzy, for tempting you into my wicked schemes and ruining our choosing day." "Thank you, Petrick," said Fris with a curt nod. She let go of his shoulder. "You may go." Petrick shuffled swiftly past his two friends and disappeared down the hallway without looking at them once and without calling Clark to come after him. The dog's tail lowered as he watched his master hurry out of sight, as if he knew he was meant to stay. Barry shot Suzy a glance. "He didn't take Clark," Barry hissed. Suzy ignored him. "Barry and Suzy," called Fris, "you may come in." She said it as if they were the ones who wanted to see her all this time. Suzy gave Barry a poke, which had the desired effect of getting him to jump reluctantly to his feet, and the two strode in after Fris. Barry motioned for Clark to follow them. "Close the door behind you," she called out. Chapter 5. The dirt clod arced high up into the air, as far as Petrick's 11-year-old arm could propel it. He watched as it reached its apex, and then acceleration gave way to gravity, and it began to tumble down. It picked up speed as it went, finally meeting its end when it smashed into the ground, and a giant dust cloud billowed out from the impact. He reached down to grab another chunk of dry dirt. This time, he aimed slightly to the right. The clod arced up and back down, much like its predecessor, but this time made its impact short of the ground, exploding onto the corrugated metal roof of a leaning and rusted shed. Petrick could hear pieces of the fragmented dirt trickling down the various U-shaped channels. They fell through the holes that water and time had eaten into the roof, and they tinkled over the stored stuff inside. It was the only building constructed from such materials Petrick had ever seen. Metal was in short supply for the technology-averse Indicarans. It took an enormous amount of time and effort to smelt and shape by hand, and so it was used only for the most important of objects, like plows, knives, or gears for the grinding stone at the mill. To build an entire structure from metal was inconceivable, even one as small as this tiny, dilapidated shed. Petrick, Suzy, and Barry called it the treasure shed. It was off in the far corner of Childers' grounds, somewhere they came often, and they called it that because of what was inside. Petrick squinted his eyes to peer through its dusty, broken windows. He could see the remnants of what used to be a workshop, which was a veritable trove of pipes and wires and parts and every other kind of farm-related machinery one could imagine. A tractor-like vehicle, long since decommissioned, sat inside. Its power source had been removed, and the rest of it was collecting dust and rust. It was one of several sources of components for Petrick's many projects in the treasure shed, but it was also a decaying reminder of a time gone by, one when his people had been machine-using spacefarers like the rest of the damned, before they had cast off the rot of outside society and chosen to live in harmony with their world. They'd used machines like that tractor to till their land, and stored them in metal buildings like the shed. Plowing a field took days now. Petrick imagined the tractor finishing the same job, in hours. How could they have abandoned such innovation, such convenience? It all seemed so backward. He grabbed another fistful of dirt with some heft to it, and threw it as hard as he could at the shed. The dirt clod clanked heavily against one of the sheet metal walls, flimsy from rust and damage accumulated by time, and dented it. The roof and broken windows shifted in one groaning movement. Petrick picked up another clod and flung it toward the same spot. His aim was true, and the clod folded the feeble wall in half. With a great dusty shudder, that entire section of the shed crumpled to the ground. Glass broke and metal clanked inside, obscured by the cloud of dust that billowed out toward Petrick. A pang of guilt shot through Petrick as the sounds of destruction died down. Crunch, he said. He jogged over toward the dusty heap, and to his dismay saw that it had almost entirely collapsed. The open area of the workshop was now a tangle of sheet metal and rotted wood, held up only by the tractor. Petrick got down on his hands and knees to get a good look at the structure. A space just large enough for an 11-year-old to stoop through was left, swirling with unsettled dust. Petrick crab-walked inside carefully, watching for nails and sharp corners. After a few feet, past the front work area, the back part of the shed opened up, and Petrick could fully stand up again. "I guess it didn't all fall down, did it?" Petrick said aloud. He ran his hand over the shelves that were still standing there. Wires, parts, nuts, bolts, hoses, and power supplies littered them. All the bits and bobs that had been his and Suzy's and Barry's to plunder for his science experiments and his inventions. This had been their treasure trove, the supply store for his various gadgets and projects. Till now, anyway. He walked through the back of the shed, which had been built right up against the exterior stone wall that surrounded all of Childer's grounds. Petrick cleared away a shelving unit that had tilted behind the collapse and saw a small hole at the bottom of the stone wall behind it. Fresh air gusted in from the other side, and Petrick knelt down and peered through to the world outside. The woods lay just beyond this corner of Childer's, and Petrick could see the trees glimmering in the high summer sun. A loose brick in the hole caught Petrick's eye, and he reached out to wiggle it. It fell easily, and behind it a couple more bricks dropped out. The hole was nowhere near large enough for anyone to wiggle through, but testing several more of the bricks in that area, Petrick wondered, "What happened to the treasure shed?" The distant, muffled voice belonged to Barry, and Petrick raised his head and turned back toward the collapsed front of the shed. There was a bark from Clark for good measure, and a moment later his brown and white body was racing through the shed into the back room. He wagged his tail and gave Petrick's hand a hello lick, then busied himself with smelling around all the damage. He sniffed extra long at the new hole in the wall. Petrick stooped and shimmied back out into the open air in time to see Barry and Suzy plodding up toward him on the path that led back down into the more central area of the grounds. Clark followed Petrick out and ran to the other two to greet them, as if he'd forgotten he'd come with them in the first place. Barry clucked his tongue when he got a close-up view of the shed. "Crunch, the whole thing collapsed almost," he said. Suzy stood like a statue and stared only at Petrick. Petrick had known she'd be mad. She was waiting, however, for him to speak first. He didn't feel like talking first. For a while, There was just the sound of hot summer air whispering over the dust and grass, and the noise of a droning cicada off in the field somewhere, or perhaps over the wall in the woods. To say the trio had come to this corner of Childers often would be an understatement. They spent nearly every day there, and the rusty shed was one of many relics from what obviously used to be a farm. There were decaying tractors and plows, as well as some sort of ground transport vehicle. An old, partially collapsed greenhouse was a few paces away, crumbled by time and neglect. There was a huge pile of wood, grayed by the sun, that they all assumed had once formed the structure of a barn because of its size. It was full of nooks and crannies and exposed nails to watch out for. The gold mine, however, had been the rusty metal treasure shed, with its wires and magnets and gears to play with and build. Suzy and Barry liked it too. It was nice to spend their own time away from the rest of the children at Childers, in their private little corner of the world. If they tired of Petrick's tinkering, they would go off on their own to pretend they were using the vehicle carcasses to plow the farm or dig up new trinkets from the past among the other fallen buildings. This wasn't the first time they'd been in trouble for following Petrick's lead and building forbidden machines. There was the glider that shot out sparks. There was the vegetable crate that wheeled around on its own. There was the racetrack where the speeding wedges didn't actually touch the track. And there was the flying metal bird with propellers for flapping wings. Each had been met with the same reprimand. Such things had no place on IndyCar. It would be best if they forgot them and turned their attention to other things, like growing squishlings or tending to livestock. The consequences had never been too harsh beyond a couple of hours of kitchen work or an extra day of field duty. This time, however, it was different. This time, outsiders had seen it. "Fris told us we're on dish duty tonight," Barry said to Petrick after he felt like the tension between the trio had simmered enough. "What'd she tell you?" Petrick shrugged and looked away. "We need to see Kitchen Master Gunther after dinner," Barry continued with a sigh. He looked over at the still silent Suzy. "Isn't that right, Suze?" She didn't answer Barry. In fact, she didn't even acknowledge him. She just stared at Petrick. After far too long in the hot summer sun, Suzy finally spoke to Petrick. "You have anything to say for yourself?" Petrick didn't respond, so Suzy stepped forward and stabbed a finger out toward him. "This is your fault, Petrick." "Hey, I was the one who dropped the treats," Barry interjected. That's beside the point, Barry," Suzy shot back at him. "It was Petrick. Well, no, if I hadn't dropped them, then Clark wouldn't have gone crazy, and the saucer wouldn't have crashed into the chandelier." "Well, that wasn't really the problem, was it, Petrick?" Petrick stood there, still not looking at his two friends. "The problem was this whole harebrained idea in the first place." "I did bring that up," Barry said with a groan. "But you guys said it was too late." "It was. What else were we going to do at that point? He promised that electrical flying machine would work." "Electromagnetic," said Petrick, correcting her. That stopped Suzy. He'd spoken, finally. "What?" "It was electromagnetic," he repeated. "Not just electrical. That's why there were no cables. And it did work." "Petrick, it didn't. It ruined the gathering hall. They canceled choosing day because of you." "Because of us," Barry offered. "Whose side are you on, Barry?" Suzy glared at him. "I'm just saying, we did agree to do it with Petrick. It was all three of us." "But it was his idea." "Barry's right," Petrick said. "You went along with it too, Suzy. You didn't think it was so stupid then." "Yes, I did. I said it was a stupid idea." "So did I," Barry said. "I feel like I've been very clear on that." "Then why did you do it with me, huh? What were you thinking?" "We trusted you, that's why. You said we'd be okay. You always say that, but we never are." Petrick finally exploded. "It doesn't matter anyway, because they're going to burn this all down. All of it. Tomorrow." He grabbed another dirt clod and flung it as hard as he could at the shed. It exploded on one of the walls. The shed began to shiver, and then with a slow, low groan, it crashed the rest of the way to the ground with a billow of dust. And then it was quiet. Barry nodded his head knowingly. "So that's what happened to the shed," he said. And that's the end of chapter 6. Awesome. Well, thank you very, very, very much for joining me. We'll pick up again tomorrow, same time, same place, with Chapter 7. Thank you so much for watching or listening. I really appreciate it. You guys make it all worth doing it. I'll see you guys tomorrow.